An aircraft crashed in the Andes highlands between Chile and Argentina on October 13, 1972, killing all 45 people on board, including a whole professional rugby team. Even though the survivors couldn't have realized it at the moment, their worst nightmare was only getting started. Because of the tremendous obstacles that the survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had to face in order to get home, their tale has been dubbed the Miracle of the Andes. Tragically, it all started when the pilot warned of impending turbulence. On their way to a match in Chile, most of them were thinking about the game that was about to happen. Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, was one of the passengers who recalled hearing someone nearby say, "Aren't we flying too close to the mountains?" A few moments later, his worst nightmare came true when the jet slammed into a mountainside. It was determined that the pilot had made a mistake, which led to the disaster. As they continued their ascent over the Andes, the pilot turned north to start descending into Santiago, Chile, but the peaks were still too high. The pilot tried to get the aircraft higher by tilting it almost vertically, but when he realized his error, the plane stalled. Spluttered by the engine, the aircraft dipped below the sky, and then it reached the peak of the mountain. A book titled "I Had to Survive: How a Plane Crash in the Andes Inspired My Calling to Save Lives" was written by Dr. Roberto Canessa after the jet crashed into the mountain. In it, he described his precise feelings at the time. After the hit, his body sprang forward and he banged his head right away, he said. His primary concern was that he was nearing the end of his life. He knelt down and started to pray. A close voice cried out, "Oh my God, save me! I need your help!" Someone else yelled out that he was legally blind at the same time. The man's brain was actually gushing out of his skull when Canessa glanced across at the wailing passenger. Like a row of dominoes, the seats slid forward toward the cockpit as the jet eventually came to a halt. Screams and the aroma of jet fuel permeated the atmosphere. The impact ripped the plane's fuselage in two. The tail vanished when it snapped apart. In the middle of a violent snowstorm, the rugby team and their loved ones who had boarded the plane were trapped, encircled by snow-capped mountains. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, the group salvaged whatever food and clothing they could find among the debris. Feeling certain that help would be on the way, they emptied their bags and laid them out in a cross shape, hoping it would be seen from above. Also, in case any aircraft were flying above, they carved an SOS message into the snow with their footprints. An aircraft and a smaller plane were reported flying above them on the second day. Each time, the survivors' spirits skyrocketed as they became more certain that help was on the way. But the days passed by with no improvement in the situation. With 45 passengers on board, Flight 571 departed. 15 more died from their wounds within a few hours, and 12 more died in the accident itself. A further casualty succumbed to their injuries 1 week subsequent to the collision. Then, tragedy struck once again on the 17th day. 8 more individuals perished when an unexpected avalanche covered the scene of the accident. Because there was no food available, the survivors' main fear was famine. But being stuck at an elevation of 11,800 feet meant that the relentless frigid temperatures were their second major challenge. The lucky few who managed to escape Flight 571 used their wits to their advantage. Using a piece of metal from an airplane seat to melt the snow, they were able to get drinking water. Also, in order to keep warm, they took apart the wool seat coverings and made blankets out of them. They discovered that they could use the seat bottoms as snowshoes since it was difficult to walk in the thick snow. As a makeshift shelter, they stuffed bags into the fuselage's open places to keep the frigid air outside. The pilot's cabin included plastic that was later used to make sunglasses. Sleeping bags were fashioned from insulation, salvaged from the plane's kitchen, and hammocks were fashioned for those who had injured their legs. The survivors would pee into rugby balls for their bathroom breaks since going outdoors in the snow would cause their pee to freeze. Roberto Canessa, who was a medical student at the time, took advantage of his inexperience to tend to the wounded. He removed fluids and put broken bones back together. Also, he took it upon himself to move the bodies, something that other people just couldn't bring themselves to do. Dr. Canessa subsequently remarked on the survivors' resourcefulness in an interview with National Geographic, stating, "You get very smart when you are dying." The food ran out 9 days after the disaster. Hunting and foraging were not an option, since the area around the crash site was devoid of vegetation, and because animals did not inhabit that elevation. After only a few days of going without food, they began to experience the horrible symptoms of starving. Those who managed to stay alive knew full well that delaying food would leave them vulnerable. In addition, they knew that, next to the fuselage, preserved in the compacted snow, were the remains of the people who had died on board. The one and only choice became clear very quickly. Some of the survivors prayed to God for direction on whether to eat their colleagues and passengers, while others fought against the idea. A lot of back and forth occurred on the squad, but ultimately hunger drove everyone to take action. Roberto Canessa, while studying medicine, was aware that, similar to other types of meat, human tissue includes proteins and lipids. Knowing it would be enough to feed the survivors who were hungry, he felt secure in slicing into one of the bodies first, because he was the only one they had for medical care. Canessa would subsequently detail the psychological hurdle he faced while attempting to devour his companion in his autobiography. He thought it was one thing to understand rationally that you had to eat to be alive, but quite another to grasp the concept that the food you were holding came from a deceased loved one's corpse. Needless to say, the survivors went through a very trying ordeal. Using a shard of glass, Canessa severed the first corpse. All but one of the survivors grabbed a chunk and devoured it immediately. At first, Coach Inciarde flat out refused to participate because the thought sickened him. However, even he caved and ate to maintain his life. What the survivors did was not cannibalism in the strictest sense. As a general rule, that word describes the nefarious tactics employed to devour a human being. Anthropophagy is the true term for what the survivors performed. In spite of the nitpickers, the survivors understood the gravity of their deeds and swore to treat them as a holy act. They designated 3 of the 10 remaining bodies as off-limits. Mother and Sister Parado, as well as Javier Mithol's nephew, were found dead there. Nobody who made it through the ordeal could bring themselves to fully commit to the thought of devouring another human being. In order to accept the reality of the situation, Canessa and the others reasoned that they would prefer to be consumed as food if the tables were turned. Eating another person, in Canessa's mind, brought them closer together, both physically and spiritually. The survivors unanimously pledged that they would gladly give their lives to save the lives of others if they too were to die. All of the frozen corpses that the squad had been subsisting on were carried away by the avalanche that occurred on the 17th day. But 8 more travelers perished in the avalanche as well. An excruciating choice was thrust upon the survivors once again. Should they devour their companions, who were once alive and well only a few hours ago? Canessa and the others redoubled their efforts to live after more deliberation, and they proceeded to feed off the passengers who had just gone missing. The group wasn't completely isolated from civilization. Even though they were stranded, they learned about the rescue operations by listening to a transistor radio. However, they received some really disturbing news on October 23, 1972. The officials decided to end the search for the downed jet after more than 100 tries. It became clear to the survivors that they would need to seek assistance independently if they were to reach safety. Not long after that, Antonio Tintin Vizintin, Canessa, and Nando Parado embarked on a trek to seek help. After making it to the peak of the mountain, they knew they had a long way to go before they could be sure they would be safe. In order to help Canessa and Parado make better use of their limited food supplies, Tintin was ordered to return to the aircraft. During the night, they braved temperatures below freezing. They were instantly filled with confidence that they would live when, after 10 days of traveling, they arrived at an area with grass and water. It took Canessa and Parado 10 days and 44 miles of hiking before they came across someone who could lend them a hand. They returned to civilization 70 days after the first catastrophe. Following their lead, officials arrived at the scene of the accident and rescued the other survivors. The incredible achievement accomplished by Canessa and Parado is even more remarkable when one considers the severity of their starvation and the very perilous terrain they traversed. 2 helicopters were sent on December 22, 1972, to search for any remaining survivors inside the plane's debris. As a result of bad weather, 6 were taken home right away, while 8 others had to wait until the next day. As news spread of the team's desperate measures to stay alive, responses went from elation and wonder to horror and revulsion, and the rescue itself became a major news story. The public was persuaded to back the survivors after they expressed their own reservations about the choice and detailed the internal struggle that followed. Most disturbing was the fact that the church condemned the survivors' deeds. The church, however, pardoned them when they clarified that they had considered their companion's ingestion a kind of communion. Following the rescue, Canessa made her way to see the families of the victims. He presented them with the last letters written by the departed. He was determined to get the word out about the survivors' experience and make sure everyone knew their predicament. The relatives of the victims would be the most incensed, in Canessa's opinion, because of how prohibited their actions were. However, he ultimately discovered that the relatives of the victims were receptive and forgiving. It was like everyone there knew that just existing was paramount. Is that so? In a situation like this, how would you stay alive? Leave a comment telling us what you think, and while you're here, watch some more weird history videos.